If I could remind my fellow members of the task force to please speak into the speaker. And anybody wanting to speak at the end of the meeting, we've got 15 minutes allocated for public comment, please sign up and remind everybody that does that should be limited to 3 minutes. So, Mr. John Baker, co-chairman, would you please now report to the committee on something not very controversial, the report from Dr. Barber.
It'd be great to have a budget. HAP asked me to bring you all up to date on our consultant, Dr. Herbert Barber, and his contract. I believe you've each received an electronic and a hard copy of his work. Needless to say, I think we were all surprised when we learned about Dr. Barber's book, Fall of the Nation, and the rather incredible dogma that he espouses in that book. As you all will recall, when we first put out the RFP, only Dr. Barber and his firm Zycon Economics responded. And because of the poor response, we rebid the RFP. And then the second time, we got 2 responses. One was a firm called BST, I think from Washington State, and also Zycon. We chose BST to negotiate with, but we couldn't come to terms with him, so we turned to Zycon. We met with Dr. Barber, the CEO of Zycon, and based on his presentation, his academic and economic credentials, we chose him for the job. Obviously, we had no idea of his political and social views. By the time we learned about his writings, he was 90% done with his work. And we were in a position where we didn't make any sense to do anything but proceed. And so representatives from the Mayor's Office of Economic Development, the Port, and I met with him a couple of times in person to review his draft. And then we accepted his paper and terminated him for convenience, which is a term that is used in the contract we had with him that allowed us to just say, you're done, but also obligated us to pay. We chose not to have him to present his findings here today because we felt that given the understandable uproar about his social beliefs at such a presentation, the meat of the coconut would be overshadowed by the other part of his writings. I've read through his report that he did give us several times. Joe, you probably can understand that kind of stuff, and Quentin, I'm sure you can, but it's hard reading. It was tough going. But I've had a lot of interactions. I've spent time with the guy trying to understand what he was trying to say, and so I'm going to attempt to give you a brief summary of his report in layman's terms, and then with the help of the OED staff and the Port, we'll attempt to answer any questions that you all might have. First, let me state the obvious. Any work done by a consultant, even one that's just reviewing another person's work, requires that consultant to make assumptions and therefore use his judgment. Personally, my trust in Dr. Barber's judgment has been impacted, and it significantly impacts the credibility I give his work. Second, however, much of what he has done has been to review John Martin's work and apply mathematical models to it. Since we paid the 60 grand for the work, I do think it is constructive to read and try to understand his findings. While I would not undertake the project based on his report, I do believe that it is additive to the other information we have received regarding the economic viability of the port dredging content project. I noticed that we don't have the slides up there, Ted.
Yeah, we can do that. We need a quick.
I wanted y'all to see my name. Dr. Barber's charge, as detailed in the, I'd go back to the one before that, please. We've done that one, so go to the next one. You can go to the next one.
Okay.
Dr. Barber's charges detailed in the RFP was threefold. You skipped one. Go back one, please. There. 3 charges. The first one was to review the economic model developed by Martin and Associates and provide an explanation regarding the validity of the methodology of the Martin study. That was the first thing that Dr. Barber did. He got on the phone with John Martin. I think I reported this to you earlier. And he got, amongst other information, he got the 7 different survey instruments which Martin had used for data collection. Martin had gone, and this is an incredibly deep undertaking, he went to 472 customers of services in the maritime industry and interviewed each one of them under a promise of confidentiality. And he had 7 different surveys. Dr. Barber, depending on what these people did for a living, Dr. Barber went through those surveys, and it was his opinion that the surveys and the methodology employed by Dr. Martin were valid. He could and would not comment on the reliability of the surveys since he was not allowed access to the raw data. He made the statement he understood why he wasn't, but he wasn't allowed access to the raw data. And as he stated on page 27 of the document, he says, regardless of the fact that he hadn't seen the data, it remains the opinion of Zycon that reasonable efforts were taken by Martin Associates to ensure validity. So the answer to the first question was a positive, but for the fact that he did not get to mine the data. His second charge was, and we can go to the next slide, please. His second charge was to make an independent determination of the business growth potential of the port with and without harbor deepening. His conclusions were that the port would continue to grow with or without the deepening, but it would be a significant increase in container tonnage if deepening occurred. The blue bars in the chart that you see here represent the, I believe that's tonnage of freight through the port. It represents the no deepening. The green represents the harbor deepening and moderate penetration scenario, and the orange represents the more aggressive scenario. He estimated that harbor deepening would add 1,872 jobs in the moderate scenario and 3,743 jobs in the aggressive scenario. This is, of course, is significant, but it is not as high as Dr. Martin's 4,699 jobs. If you remember from the Martin report, he has the direct jobs, and then he puts in what he calls induced jobs and indirect jobs. And if you add in the induced and indirect jobs, the 4,699 jobs goes to 11,642 by 2030. So when we, if you compare 1872 to something that's apples and apples, compare it to the 4,699, if you would. Let's go to the next slide if we could. The top chart shows the revenues to the port without deepening, that's the orange bars, with deepening in the moderate penetration scenario, and orange in the, I guess it's green in the significant, in an aggressive scenario. Dr. Barber points out that it is statistically significant that the change in revenues to the port with harbor deepening. The bottom graph, interestingly, shows Martin on the left in blue and Zycon on the right on their estimates of the future of the harbor without deepening. I think it's pretty interesting that they're very similar, and yet their methodology is very different. Dr. Martin mined the data, talked to people, grew the data that way. Dr. Barber did it purely on mathematical regression analyses. The next slide, please. The third charge we gave to Dr. Barber was to weigh the cost versus the benefits of dredging. The left side of the chart below the line shows the expenses incurred in the dredging year by year. It goes on for what looks to be 6 years, in that scenario it's really 4 or 4.5 years of heavy construction. So the left side is the outflow of money from the city. The right side shows the benefits in green from the dredging induced cargo. This is Dr. Barber's, what he called his conservative, which would line up with Dr. Martin's, what did he call it, moderate penetration scenario. And the conservative scenario of Dr. Barber yields a 3-year payback and a 4.82 cost-benefit ratio. If we were to look at the more aggressive scenario, it's nearly double that with a 9.63 benefit cost ratio and a 2-year payback. So that's sort of a quick rundown through his findings. I, of course, have left out a lot of charts and analysis that he gave us. But let me, just for my reading, and this is me, some of the things that I feel like need to be pointed out, because I think to understand his report, whether we give it credibility or not, there's several things stand out for me. One is, as we said in the beginning, while Barber did not have access to Dr. Martin's data, he did have access to those survey instruments Martin used to gather data, and he found it to be thorough, robust, and valid. Serving 472 customers, a report is diligent and certainly robust. Second, as I went through Dr. Barber's analysis and his underlying assumptions, I found them in many cases to be very, very conservative. One really critical assumption he made was when he was computing the growth of tonnage after deepening. He developed a model that said that tonnage would grow in line with GDP. Martin had used some of that same analysis, and he found that to be valid. But then he took GDP from the years 2005 through 2014 as being representative of the future of after 2020. Well, we all know what happened between 2005 and 2014. There was a little recession, and arguably that would make that very conservative point of view as far as growth of the TEUs in the market. Dr. Barber, in his cost-benefit analysis, focuses on mathematical models. And he is, he's not somebody that is interested in the kind of data that Dr. Martin collected that has a lot of, this is what I think, or this is what's going to happen. He doesn't care about that. He looks at the numbers, what was the history of the growth of certain commodities in the port, and he charts it out meticulously and carefully. One of the things that he did not take into consideration as a result of that methodology was the I don't know whether you call it a threat or just a likelihood that we would lose TRAPAC and much of the Asian container traffic if we didn't deepen the harbor. So that's not in his mind. And so as a result, and I do believe it is in Dr. Martin's model, but though I don't know, I can't tell, there's no way to tell. He certainly talks about it. But that would explain why the number of jobs is so dramatically different in their outcomes come 2030, because I think Dr. Barber just doesn't look at that, and I think that tends to make it more conservative. On the other hand, and I think this is just as important, Dr. Barber accepts three key assumptions from Martin's work that really drive the numbers in his models. First, he adopts Dr. Martin's conclusion that each 1,000 TEUs of freight drives the creation of 0.74 jobs. If you think about it, both guys are using that same conversion factor. Maybe that makes it more valid, maybe it makes it less valid, but it's certainly, he's not being critical of Dr. Martin of that, and I think in his report he actually says he has no other way to find a good relationship, and so he uses Dr. Martin's. Secondly, he accepts Dr. Martin's scenario, and this is the moderate scenario, that if dredging occurs, 1/4 of the freight will be diverted, that's used in Florida, will be diverted to Florida's ports, and Jacksonville will capture 1/3 of it. In the aggressive scenario, the 1/4 becomes 50%. And so Dr. Barber takes that as, he says that Dr. Martin's analysis of that was textbook, that he went about coming up with that in the right way, but he absolutely adopts that assumption, and it's key, it's major. Lastly, he accepts Dr. Martin's multiplier that converts the volumes to direct business revenue. If you look at the last couple of pages of his report, you can see that the volumes are like this as far as the payback analysis, and then the direct business revenue goes way up like this. It is significant to his findings that he would use the same formula or however you could say it, methodology as Dr. Martin. Now, throughout his report, Dr. Barber, and I must tell you, this irritated me because he accepted the terms of our RFP, but throughout his report, he says that there needs to be significant more study done in order for a lot of these findings to really be validated. Like I said at first, I thought he was haggling for more business. When it became obvious that he wasn't going to get any more business, he continued that diatribe, so I can only assume this was not a sales pitch. There we are. That's indeed a thumbnail sketch of 100 and so pages of very complicated report, and I would throw it open to questions from the task force, and we'll try to answer any we can, or comments, obviously.
Number one, I thank you and the Economic Division of the city and the Port Authority. From what I understand, that was a not easy process that you guys have been through. I think there's a couple questions before us. Number one, do we want to take it as is, so to speak, tainted, given the the controversy surrounding it? We can ignore the report as far as our view going forward, and then I think the other question is do we have enough information at this point in time, taking the revenue part of it aside, to have a discussion at next month's meeting, like we talked about having, to make a decision as far as does this make economic viability, and how high do we want to set the bar from an environmental mitigation standpoint? And I think those are the two questions that I think are before the task force. Because the thought was, and it would still be my recommendation, that we have a tremendous amount of information. We've heard a lot of expert witnesses, we've heard a lot of industry folks. Even if you disregard this report, there's a lot that's there, and that's the question: is do we have the information after going back to May of last year to say, is this port deepening economically viable? All this obviously assumes that we can find a revenue source for it, which would be the next step. And then where should the bar be set from a environmental mitigation standpoint? And that was the plan, to have the discussion at the next meeting in April. And John, once again, thank you.
Well, if the question is about whether to accept Dr. Barber's work, I'll just say that based on what I was reading, his viewpoints, and even as I started into his report, I had a lot of questions as to whether I even wanted to read the full report. But as I read through it in great detail and spent a lot of time on it, I actually saw tremendous value in the information in the report. And I put the other elements of Dr. Barber himself aside, and I focused on the content of what we've been presented. And I think it is really important stuff, and I think it will be very positive for us to accept the information and use it as the chairman's presented to us today, because I do think it presents a lot of really good comparisons to Dr. Martin's work. As he indicates, very different approach, but some real good comparisons in terms of the predictions and data. So I think we should accept the report produced on this task force.
I agree that we should accept it. I have to admit I had misgivings that I read it. I don't agree with some of the things he did. in the report, and I'm going to separate everything else, but I think I'm supposed to do that. Some of his graphs are really strange, and I'll just use that term. To use the circular graphs that he did on linear things, I've used that for circadian rhythms and daily activities, but not a linear function made them really hard to read. In terms of a consultant's report, I hate to say it like this, when you're working on getting a doctorate and PhD, you're taught to ask more questions than you answer, and he did that, which is why I think he sort of said, oh, we got to do more studies. Scientists always want more studies. I thought it was also interesting because he's taking on a very complex topic that we've sort of discovered. But the whole report is sprinkled with all kinds of disclaimers and ways out. And, you can say this, but, and if you assume this, then this. And so he sort of gives himself a lot of room there. I did come away with the conclusion that all of the projections we're seeing are optimistic. You sort of, Zycon came up with a lower number of jobs and a little bit more realistic number, I think. But I still think it's over-optimistic, particularly when we learn about what's happening in the port industry and how much automation is going on and those kinds of things. The other thing in both cases, in the Martin report as well as Zycon's, I haven't been totally clear, and maybe Brian Taylor can help us with this. I haven't been totally clear on what happens without port development or harbor deepening in terms of what kind of money do we need to spend anyway to get the port up to the same kind of intermodal capacity that Savannah, Charleston, and other ports have. Monday night at the town hall that David Jaffe put together, Brian went through a list of things that are going to have to happen in terms of bulkheads and berthings that need to be improved, cranes that need to be purchased, the North Florida rail corridor, all those kind of costs that my conclusion has been, as we've gone through this, that we need to do those things anyway. And that even if we don't harbor deepen now, that we need to make sure that we've got our port as competitive as it possibly can be. And that's,
Do you want to ask Brian to come up?
well, I don't think we're prepared to do it right now, or whether we want to wait until next month to do it. I'm just sort of posing that as a question.
I'll answer it for you now and get it off the table, I guess. So, the projects that we have undertaken now with the berth improvements, the cranes, the ICTF, all of that work is now underway and is work that essentially is required regardless of whether we deepen the harbor or not. The berths at Blunt Island have to be replaced. They're old, and so we are going through the process of replacing them. We are taking them to 50 feet to ensure that they're prepared for whatever the future depth of the channel may be here. We have ordered 3 cranes. Those cranes will come regardless of whether the channel is deepened or not, because we need to move 2 cranes from Blunt Island down to Talleyrand to handle the Crowley business, and so we're replacing them with 3 brand new cranes.
Is all that funded?
It's funded, yes.
Okay, you're moving cranes to Talleyrand, but we're not deepening to Talleyrand.
No, because Crowley is going to be bringing new ships to our Talleyrand terminal, which you saw through the announcement that came out last week. And our crane reach at Talleyrand today does not reach the breadth of their ship. So we will have to relocate 2 of our newest cranes from Blunt Island down to Talleyrand by 2017 to accommodate their new ships.
So that's happening without harbor deepening.
Yeah, that's all happening without harbor deepening. So the dollars that we're spending today are being spent in accordance with our strategic plan, which is to make sure dollars we spend today don't have to be ripped out and spent again if we deepen the harbor. So we're replacing berths that need to be replaced, but we're replacing them to 50 feet. So we're ready if the channel gets deepened. We have to bring in 2 new cranes. We're actually bringing in 3, and they're going to be 100-foot gauge super post Panamax. So if the harbor gets deepened, we've got cranes sitting on that berth that can accommodate the largest ships that we would handle.
Would you need additional cranes if you had the harbor deepening then at Fort Island?
Yeah, we'll need additional cranes regardless because our cranes are aging. They're over 25 years, and we'll have to replace some more of those cranes. We haven't yet determined the time frame as to when to do that, but they're going to have to be replaced regardless. But they'll be replaced with the kinds of cranes that we would want to use, not just today, but we want to use in the future.
Right. So I understand, the shuffle is, we took 2 of our newer cranes from Long Island, we're going to move them, we're going to move them to Talleyrand, and then we're going to put 3 brand new, even bigger cranes at
Yes.
Long Island.
That's correct. That's correct.
And what about the intermodal part of the question?
The intermodal part of our plan was also designed to support a larger amount of intermodal cargo at the tray pack facility with larger ships bringing more freight, some of that being intermodal freight destined to places beyond Jacksonville. We needed a rail terminal that would be adjacent to the berth and would allow us to compete with other ports that have on-dock or near-dock rail. And so that work is underway and will be completed by the end of this year, obviously well before we deepen the harbor. Now, we have commented before. In fact, I think we had somebody present here about the North Jacksonville Rail Corridor, and that project is in the hands of the North Florida TPO to finalize a routing that would eventually provide a more economical and from a time perspective and from a safety perspective, a better way to route freight north of the city and across to the main line of CSX. That benefits our project, but it also benefits Fernandina, and it benefits a lot of other pieces of rail business that wouldn't have to be routed through the city. And that project doesn't have a specific price tag on it. I have heard numbers of 40 million, 50 million. I'm not sure exactly where that eventually pencils out. And that is not funded at this point, although I do know CSX has pledged a significant number of dollars. I think the number was 40 million that would be available at some point for that project.
And with that $40 million, or the amount that they would pledge, I thought there were, remembering from Fred Eliason's presentation, that it might be unlikely that would occur if the port were not deepened, or
There is what Fred said. What Fred said is we need to show CSX that there's a justifiable business case for them to spend the money. And in his words, if I'm not mistaken, harbor deepening, getting more intermodal volume in here on bigger ships was part of the business case that would justify their investment.
Yeah, I really don't have much of an opinion on Dr. Barber accepting or not accepting. We've reviewed it, so I guess there's a form of acceptance. I've read it. It's kind of, for me, compared to the Martin report, it's almost a Me Too affirmation of the Martin findings. Given the difference in methodology, I think the difference in jobs, et cetera, are relatively minor and kind of address the same thing. I think probably the most important thing at this time is, in my own head at least, I've decided that this deepening is a bit of a defensive measure. Everybody else is doing it. If we don't deepen, we will become, at best, a port for the Caribbean, shallow draft vessels. And if we deepen, we can play in the game. which brings up, I think, a very, very crucial issue is what do we do about our river? What do we do about protecting the environment? I think the compromise that was reached, it moves us in the right direction. I hope that that can become a fait accompli. And then, if indeed we run into problems that are not anticipated, what mechanism do we have for dealing with the unforeseen? But it seems to me that we're on a path of deepening the harbor. And what we should be doing is taking a real hard look to make sure that we've got our environmental house in order, because it's going to be awfully difficult, I think, for someone to take the Martin study, the V2 study, the feelings in the community, and say we're going to not play defense here. And I know that there will be those that say, oh my goodness, this isn't defense, you just watch us go on offense. But the project itself is to some extent a me too. It's doing what others are doing that are in competition with this port. And I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's kind of where I'm landing, John.
I think at this point in time, the decision we need to make is, do we need another consultant? In my view, we can assume that the Martin study is too conservative, too liberal, but when you look at his resume, 800 port studies for Houston, Long Beach, you're not going to get, every major port in America, you're not going to get, so to speak, a better expert. Doesn't mean that you can't question. So I would think we've got enough information, plus the industry groups, to sit around and make a decision on what the economic viability, and then, as you said, Pete, how high and if we decide yes, where does the bar want to be set from an environmental mitigation standpoint to protect our community's greatest resource?
Well, I think what Pete's talking about is actually what worries me the most, is because everybody else is doing it. And we hear we're going to have bigger ships, which means fewer ships, and the transport of materials is changing. And that's the part that I continue to wrestle with. I think I've said it to you before, but I had sort of an aha moment a few months ago when I realized that the Panama Canal was finished in 1914, and yet it was 2010 before Jacksonville got to 40 feet. And so we're all racing to get a bite of a smaller and smaller pie. And I wish in some respects there was a national policy on port development, because I think as a nation, we're going to spend billions and billions of dollars to get everybody to compete. That is only going to drive the net revenue down, which makes the payout longer. Couple that with the environmental damage that I think is going to happen. I think I've been pretty clear that I don't think the Corps has done a very good job of recognizing that. And so I think we're struggling with that. And the promise that the Corps makes that, oh yeah, well, if we made a mistake, we'll correct it, but that involves congressional approval, and I've got 0 for that right now. So.
You'll probably have 0 votes on this task force for that. Would be my assumption. So.
Yeah, John, I'm comfortable that we have enough information to make a decision on the economics, and then asking the question around the environmental issues is the second half.
And then you've got a third half, which gets back to the rationalization that I think is going to ultimately happen. Is how do you pay for it? Which is no minor issue.
So, but I think, with everything that we've been shown and the presentations that we've heard, the materials that we've been given to read,
I think the folks sitting around the table are probably, able to comment on the economic viability of this, and then, we've got the other issues.
Would it make sense, based on what we're hearing, to, at the next meeting, which I applaud your comments about waiting, because I think we ought to have as many of our task force as possible here to vote on it. But if we were to vote that it is economically viable, then I think your idea of turning to the mitigation and what we do to make sure that we protect our river is just as important, if not more important, to our task force. And we've had some presentations on what mitigation would be appropriate to offset this, and maybe we ought to see if Quentin, would you help us organize a presentation so that we can determine what would make, good sense about protecting the river?
We can try.
John, just as part of that, if there can be a discussion on just what the decision-making process is with respect to the Rodman Dam specifically, if that's appropriate, we'd like to see that, because everyone's mentioned that not necessarily as a silver bullet, but something that would be terribly constructive.
I think there's three levers that can be pulled. It's the septic tank issue that needs to be reduced, potentially reducing the amount of water that's coming out, and then increasing the amount of water coming in through the Rodman Dam breaching. And all three of those could have and some combination of that could have a major impact.
I'd broaden the septic tanks to just nutrient loading in the river, because there's a whole bunch of things other than just septic.
Right. But those things have a very, very meaningful impact on protecting the river. If there's I think we have a discussion on whether it makes sense to consider the financing, but have a discussion, do we think it makes sense for the city and this task force to go forward with this project, and then what should call the mitigation plan or the river preservation plan be? And from my perspective, John, just your thoughts on trying to articulate that. And then if we get to that point, then I would think that we would need, and we can achieve consensus, then we would need to figure out a way to address how you pay for that.
Which may never fly.
Which may never fly.
Is there any idea of the costs that would be involved in septic tank, nutrients in general, Rodman Dam? What kind of number are we talking about to accomplish all or most of that?
Number we've heard on Rodman Dam is 25 million. Septic tank, I'll look at Lisa here.
I mean, to solve the problem, but
It's a much bigger number.
to address the, correct.
The whole nutrient loading thing is a much more complex.
There are two different, Lisa Ryman, St. John's River Keeper, there's two different numbers on nutrient pollution removal and protection. One on the septic tanks that the city's presented is 300 million. And then overall looking at other sources, including better wastewater treatment facilities, better stormwater management, less runoff from agriculture, it's like 700 million in the lower basin. And those numbers could give and take, but that's something we can get better numbers from the city for that next discussion, but it would be in those ballparks.
And then you can get, the other piece of it, and I've been talking about this from the beginning, is tributary protection and working on tributaries. And to be honest, that even ripples up into things like street sweeping and increasing the frequency of street sweeping, which decreases the amount of sedimentation and nutrients running in the river that falls off our roads and yards and gets blown off by people in their yard that put leaves into the street. So it's a very complex problem, and we're probably talking $1 billion or better.
To do it all.
Yeah.
But that would be a major, but what I'd like to hear and for consideration is, because I think that without trying to question the Corps of Engineers findings, et cetera, we're at a moment where we ought to raise the bar. And what are some practical, realistic ways that we can raise the bar as far as preserving our river over and above what I think the impact might be, may or may not be from the.
Well, you know, we may also look at this as things we should recommend that happens to the river regardless of whether the department believes it or not. You know, there are a whole bunch of us that have felt for 30 plus years that the Robin should come down. It really doesn't have what I'll call a useful function in a lot of ways. You're going to hear all kinds of rhetoric now. It's a fishing resource and it's a water resource, it's all these things. But the reality is that a naturally functioning Ocklawaha River, and maybe even calling it the Ocklawaha Restoration, as Lisa tries to keep me doing, is better than talking about the Robin Dam removal. If you happen to have seen the UNF study that came out recently, they talk about the value of the river. A huge part of that had to do with something called ecological services, which means the functions that the river performs in removing nutrients. And right now, the wetlands that are flooded by the Rodman Pool don't process nutrients the same way they would if they were wetlands. And so restoring that, and it's almost 15,000 acres, when you look at the total amount of impact, 15,000 acres of nutrient removal potential by the Ocklawaha has a significant beneficial price tag that probably far exceeds the cost of the $25 million to lower it.
Oh yeah, I mean what's amazing about that is that 25, the ROI on the $25 million is extraordinary.
That's the best
But
economic.
I do think that that's a great first step. But in any of this, trying to seek out the right compromise and the right course of action, we've got to make sure that the best enemy of the enemy of the good. So if we can get a very, very good result along with what appears to be really almost a fait accompli, if we find the money for deepening the harbor, I'd walk away feeling that we had done a very, very good job. I'd like to see us have nirvana, but I doubt that we'll have the money or the ability to sell that. So I hope we can find something here that reasonable people could agree on that would make this a much, much better project for people today and those that come after us.
I happened said there were three things, and we didn't talk about one of them, and I just would ask the question. One of them was stopping or slowing the amount of water we're taking out of the other end. Do we have, I mean, is there an appropriate recommendation? Is there a way to do that? Because if there's one thing I would have been afraid of is that we made this great recommendation, we found a way to pay for it, we found a way to deepen the river, we found a way to create these jobs, we found a way to offset the environmental impacts even beyond those that were created, with the multiple things. So now we've got a healthier river with a healthier economy and healthier all these things, and then they turn around and just take out more water and, ultimately spoiling our plot. It's like, oh, we did this better thing, we created a better thing, and then someone just said, oh, look at that, you got us more water, and your river's healthier, so we're just going to draw it down right now. Like, what recommendation do we have? We didn't have, it seemed like there was a district and a guy, and he made a call, and he was one of the less credible people that spoke in front of us, in my opinion. It was like a bureaucrat. Yeah, I was cringing while I was talking.
You weren't alone.
That's a hard problem, but what you're talking about is trying to change people's behavior. And water use we've got to stop putting half the drinking water we have on our yards. And, it's a difficult problem, but it's interesting because if you look at people's behavior, we are in fact using less water. We're also using less electricity. That's coming down the pipe, and you hear from NPR on the national perspective as a national problem, because utilities aren't going to have the same revenue stream that they had years ago. And I think we're going to continue to see people use less and less water and less electricity, and it's going to impact the way we.
Are you trying to tie this into a funding source for the pension fund?
Well, and honestly, you mentioned the pension fund, but there's a problem that they've been wrestling with now for how many years, and trying to find the money for it.
Well, what I would personally, following up on John's comment, what I would love to see at the next meeting to go with the discussion of the economic viability and art of the doable, it's going to have a meaningfully positive impact on the river. Because, speaking for myself, if I believe that the thing is economically viable, to not use this opportunity to make a positive impact on our river would be something I don't want to be part of. Opportunity-wise. So we'll have the discussion next week and next month. The date of that is April 11th. Public comment. Is there anything else the task force wants to?
I would like to say something. When we first started talking, I didn't really realize all of the environmental issues that we've had with the river. I think we're addressing problems that we've already got now. We're trying to fix those problems, plus fix problems that we might have in the future. But at the same time, I think we really, really do have to take a look at this deepening. I think we have to take a serious issue with this because in our business, right now, I am shipping about 60 containers down south because some of the vessels that I need coming in here are not coming into Jacksonville, okay? Now, I'm bringing about sometimes as many as 90 into Jacksonville. The shipping out, I'm shipping maybe 10, 12, but if we don't deepen this port, I'm telling you, we're going to miss an opportunity. We've got the prime location. We've got a better location than some of the other ports north of us, south of us. And we've got access. You've got 95, over 10, 75. We've got the better location, in my opinion, than some of the other locations that we're talking about north of us. So we really got to take a serious look at this. But at the same time, the information has really been good because I didn't realize all of the environmental issues that we have now. And I think we need to address those issues if we possibly can and to take care of the river going forward.
The part that continues to worry me is the fact that our location hasn't changed, it's not going to change. And yet Savannah has been growing so much faster than we are. That was part of my question to Brian was, we need to make sure that regardless whether the harbor gets deepened, that we have done everything we can to make sure the port is as competitive as it possibly can be. We heard Monday night at the task force that some of the newer ships will carry more containers but not take as much draft. And so, that's why when I look at this whole question, it's so complex and there's so many variables. And collectively, we all do a really bad job, a really lousy job of looking into the future. In fact, some of us have trouble looking backwards, So, we seem to repeat the same mistakes. And I want to make sure we don't make a mistake.
Yeah, I think we haven't done a good job in the past taking care of the river, sounds like. But I didn't realize that. This has been very informative.
It has. And yes.
Before, you're about to go to public comment?
We're going to, I got to prove that I was reminded by the sheriff that we need to have the minutes approved first.
So I was just going to, you want to approve the minutes?
But you go.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye. Now, was it, a couple of people have made reference to the forum, or the, I guess it's a public workshop on Monday night. Town hall on Monday night. I just wanted to make a comment to Dr. Jaffe and others who participated in that. I had a chance to attend most of that, and I thought it was outstanding. And to those that served on the panel, I appreciate the time that you invested in that. I went knowing that there were 3 hours blocked for that, and wondered how in the world 3 hours would be needed. And when I got there and saw the line of questionnaire, or those that were going to ask questions, and started hearing the questions, I then realized why 3 hours was indeed needed. But I thought that the questions were excellent. I thought the panelists did an excellent job. I took a lot away from that. I thought it was great dialogue. And frankly, I thought it was the kind of dialogue we need more in this community. So my hat's off to those who put that together.
Thank you, Joe. And speaking of which, Dr. Jaffe, thank you for running the public forum, and you wanted to make some comments.
Okay.
And I would have been there, but I was being grilled by investors and.
Thank you. My comments are based on the substance of the report submitted by Zycon Economics, not Barbara's political views. I prefer to comment on the actual merits and demerits of the report, and I appreciate your review of it. I think it was very accurate, very fair, and very balanced. I'll refer to the author as Zycon in order to avoid personalizing the discussion, and in recognition that the analysis was likely conducted by a larger staff at Zycon Economics. To its credit, I think Zycon recognizes and acknowledges the inherent complexity of the cost, benefit, and economic impact task, as well as the limitations of econometric models to answer public policy questions, unlike Martin Associates. Throughout the report, there are valuable cautions identified and important insights revealed about the port infrastructure economic impact linkage. I fear most readers of the report will not pay attention to these warnings and simply look at the bottom line of a flawed, I think, dollar cost against dollar benefit calculation. Zycon makes very clear, specifically over the first 10 pages of the report and throughout, that a sound decision by the task force would require consideration of a wide range of factors that are not incorporated in Zycon's nor Martin's narrow econometric impact forecasting models. In fact, Zycon suggested no task force decision should be made without an analysis of the interdependencies and interrelationships among industrial sectors in the port and the causal direction of those effects. Not without developing stronger analytical models. Importantly, not without looking more closely at how it relates to relatively simultaneous harbor deepening projects in Miami, Savannah, Charleston, Norfolk, and other East Coast ports. They go on, without analyzing the current state of U.S. and world economies and trends, without couching estimates of economic benefits with subject matter expertise in multiple areas of infrastructure and industry. And finally, no decision should be made purely on the basis of financial feasibility. They describe their analysis as a financial feasibility report, not an economic feasibility report. So by Zycon's own admission, this study does not constitute comprehensive cost-benefit analysis. There are two additional valuable lessons I think one can derive from the report. First, Zycon emphatically emphasized that the presence of an investment in port infrastructure does not automatically produce positive economic effects. These depend on other factors that are far beyond the control of the port, and they must be analyzed independent of financial feasibility. Second, Zycon warns against placing any faith in long-term projections that extend beyond 2020. Recall that Martin's projected impacts are estimated out to 2035. These numbers have been used widely to justify the project with no comparable warnings regarding their inherent unreliability. Also note that even under the...
Sorry.
What?
30 seconds.
Oh, 30 seconds? Okay. Well, let me get to the fatal demerit in the Zycon projection model, and that's its narrow financial cost-benefit calculation and the acceptance and inclusion rather than critical evaluation and assessment of Martin assumptions. Most significantly, that a certain percentage of the Asian container cargo will be captured by Jackport, or what Mark refers to as aggressive penetration. Similarly problematic, Zycon uses the same multiplier for jobs and business revenue as Martin, rather than assessing the validity and reliability of these measures. In short, Zycon has accepted all the assumptions used by Martin and thus produces a similarly flawed analysis of even the financial feasibility. So my recommendation to the task force would be to take the limitations cited by Zycon very seriously. If you're going to gather additional information, I would actually look for some of the information that could supplement what you have in the particular areas that Zycon identifies, which are not in any way included in what they describe again as a financial, not an economic feasibility report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you again for public forum. John Nooney? I'll wave my hand to 30 seconds, okay?
Okay. Hello, my name is John Nooney, 8356 Bascom Road, Jacksonville, Florida, 32216. Thank you for the opportunity to speak and to address this task force. I simply just would like for the memorandum of understanding, with the breaching of the Rodman ban, to be removed as a mitigation tool for this harbor redoing project. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dave Burley? I apologize, I should know by now.
Yeah, it's Dave Bruder. I live in Southside. I was watching CNN report yesterday on the guy that lost his arm, the reporter. And in the middle of that was a television ad by the America's Natural Gas featuring Tote Marine Services, featuring a ship being built in San Diego powered by America's Natural Gas. I have never seen an ad for an Asian supersized container ship being built to comply with the IMO emission standards that are coming into effect in 2016. It's powered by oil. Never seen an ad for that. I made the comment at the public hearing is that you guys need to understand why these supersized container ships are being built. And they're being built by an international treaty that the United States signed and is being implemented by the US EPA based on the Safety at Life at Sea treaties that started after the Titanic sank. That said every ship has to have enough lifeboats for the passengers. That has been extended into not just oil spills and ballast water and bilge water control, but it's been extended into sulfur emissions, particulate emissions, which is why we're doing the LNG ships here in Jacksonville. We have a 200-mile air pollution control limit, and it includes the Caribbean and within the East Coast of the United States. You have to meet that international standard. And in 2016, new ships have to meet a carbon standard. Greenhouse gas emissions per ton-mile of cargo carried across the oceans. And this applies to any ocean-going ship greater than 400 deadweight tons. Tote and Sea Star have figured out how to do this without dredging the ports that they serve because they're using a cleaner, low-carbon fuel. Our friends in Asia are taking the build it bigger approach and asking you, us, we American taxpayers, to subsidize their bigger, slower ships that will comply with this new emission standard. It's a subsidy. Dredging our ports, $40 billion for East and West Coast ports, is a direct subsidy to Asian shipbuilders, Asian manufacturers, Asian investors, and speculators that basically make it difficult for American manufacturers to compete when they look at life cycle carbon emissions when they make decisions as to where to manufacture their products. Cross-border barge canal. Jacksonville owns the Rodman Dam. Cross-border barge canal was created by Jacksonville business interests, and that project was obsolete when it was funded. It was based on obsolete ship technology, on an argument you could bring coal and oil from the Gulf into Jacksonville and create jobs. And nobody tested that business plan before it was built because it was built before NEPA. President Obama made a big mistake when he put these East Coast fast track dredge projects on a fast track. He bypassed the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. There was never a programmatic assessment of this significant federal action as required by federal law. And if I were the Environmental Defense Fund president, who owns takes responsibility for killing the cross-border barge canal in partnership with Florida Defenders of the Environment, I would be looking hard at this Rodman Dam situation and asking, why do we have to do the Rodman Dam remediation and link it to another project that made the same mistakes that the business community made when they rushed to build the cross-border barge canal? Look at the advanced ship designs, look at the transshipment terminals in the Caribbean and Panama, and ask your port guys to put on paper why they think those alternatives are not going to be competitive with a deep draft supersized container ship that may not even use the Panama Canal. Look at the alternatives and the technology of the shipping before we rush out to continue to subsidize our competition in Asia. Think globally, act locally.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I took 6 minutes.
Okay.
This is a complicated issue, and I need more time, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Lisa.
Hello again, Lisa Reineman, your St. Johns River Keeper, and thank you for your discussion about protecting the St. Johns today. It's music for my ears, because unfortunately we have not taken as good a care of our river as we should. This morning at Waterways Commission, we talked about us not meeting our goals for nutrient pollution. We're behind, unfortunately. So there is a lot of catching up to do, and the salinity increases that we know will happen with the dredging of the river will only make the pollution problems worse, because it's going to damage the kidneys of our rivers with our grasses and our wetlands. Unfortunately, we do not have faith in the Army Corps' work. You don't have to look any further south than Miami and Biscayne Bay to see what's going on. Back when I presented to y'all in October or November of last year, the damage that I showed you was actually in the cone of impact that they predicted, but the Corps admits it's the worst case scenario, and they're having major problems. In addition to that, as a result of a legal settlement, the Corps agreed to relocate some of the coral into a very safe, conservative area far away from that cone or predicted cone of impact. Now those areas that they thought were the most conservative are coated with sedimentation and killing precious endangered coral. So even the most conservative estimates given by the Corps, they admitted on Monday night at the town meeting they did not have a good track record. And that's why it's so important to go above and beyond, like you mentioned, to protect the St. Johns River, because it is an economic driver. It's our greatest natural asset. It's critical to the success of not only our community, but all the counties along her banks. So mitigation, I look forward to that further discussion, because as meaningful as the Ocklawaha restoration is as mitigation, it's not a silver bullet. It does not do everything it needs to do. However, it is extremely meaningful in regards of offsetting the loss of grasses and wetlands and the impact to our fisheries, because of 15,000 acres of wetlands that will be restored, the natural flow of the Ocklawaha, that hydrologic connection that will be restored, in addition to the protection to Silver Springs and the open up of migratory patterns for fisheries. So all of that adds up to extreme value, but it does not do anything for sedimentation, as well as the erosion impacts of the homes along the dredge corridor. I'm going out tomorrow with some homeowners on one of our boats to look at that impact, to see what's already happening, and that's something we continue to talk with Jacksport as well as the city that needs to be addressed proactively, because there will be impacts. We've already seen them. They happen during the maintenance dredges as well. And so we need to look at our river holistically, which brings up my last point. You asked about surface water withdrawal. That's something that you could all help with right now. Unfortunately, the legislature is not helping us. Just last week, they prioritized surface water withdrawals over water conservation. We have a water use problem, not a water supply problem. The Senate can help us, and so if y'all are interested in doing some proactive things to help the St. Johns River, I'll make that information available to you to help us with protecting our water resources with water conservation, as well as we'll start having conversations in Tallahassee about the Ocklawaha restoration. But thank you for your time.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Chairman, can I ask Lisa a question? Do you know what the steps are on the Rodman deal? Is that going to be dealt with by the legislature in this session?
Well, there's actually 3 different paths. I'll tell you 2 because I don't want to give my strategy away to the Jax board at the moment. But 2 of the strategies is one is the federal challenge of the Army Corps' work. One of the legal remedies is war mitigation. The memo of understanding that we announced at the last meeting or discussed, and thank y'all for endorsing, is a coalition of unlikely partners to have an extremely public and extremely contentious debate, which is happening now. The Save the Rodman Dam folks, that didn't sound right. The Save the Rodman Dam organization, they are working very hard to make a lot of noise. We've had one meeting down in Palatka that was 2 hours of very strong opinions, but it was needed because there was a feeling they were being left out. Next week, there's a meeting of stakeholders between Putnam County, Clay County, St. Johns County, and Duval County to really focus on building an economic and environmental solution and program around a restored Ocklawaha River. So we're hoping that meeting's very productive. If that meeting is productive, that conversation will move to Tallahassee.
For this legislative session?
Yes, sir.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Brian Taylor?
Thank you. Brian Taylor, Jacksport. I was not going to get up for public comment, but I just wanted to clarify a couple of comments that came up today. First one around a shrinking pie. I personally, as well as what's supported by trade statistics, say that the pie is not shrinking. In fact, the pie is continuing to grow. Based on world GDP growth and forecasts for U.S. GDP growth, our container volumes are expected to triple by 2030. U.S. import growth is targeted to be at 4.4% per year through 2041 and export growth at 6% through 2041. So the pie is actually growing. It's not shrinking. So when we talk about this project, it's not just about today. It is about the next 25 years and having the capacity to handle that kind of growth. So where is that freight going to go? A lot of that freight is going to come right here to the south. Population growth in the south since 2000 through 2010, 14.3%. The south now represents 36% of this country's population, and it's going to continue to grow. By 2050, 56 million people are expected to come to the states in the south. 6 of the 10 fastest growing counties in this country, where are they located? They're located right here in the southern states. So when we talk about deepening this harbor and Charleston and Savannah, you're talking about deepening these harbors to accommodate a tremendous amount of growth over the next 25 years, and all those ports will need to be deepened to accommodate that kind of volume based on population growth. I did want to comment on, I did not correct the individual that talked about the Samex class vessels on Monday. The Samex class vessels are the vessels that Dr. White just mentioned that are supposed to be large and shallow draft. I've actually been to Copenhagen. I've met with Maersk. I've talked to them about the Samex class vessels, and an 8,500 TEU ship is not going to draft 36 feet of water. Unfortunately, it's going to draft closer to 45 to 47 feet of water. I'm not convinced that the technology is there.
No, you've got 3 seconds.
I got 3 seconds.
30.
I'm not convinced that the technology is there based on our conversations directly with the people that actually are building the ships and are going to operate the ships. Thank you very much.
Any other comments from the committee? We'll see you April 16th. Board meeting then, and look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all very much.
What time that day?
3:30, is it not?
guys at 3.
3 o'clock, 3 o'clock.
April 11 or April 13?
6:15.
16.
Oh, yeah.